I never carry my Swiss Army knife anymore because they take it away when you get on the airplane, so I never have a screwdriver when I need one. But okay, let's get started. Thanks for being here. I'll sort of try and put things in context, and then I have a number of panelists who will address specific aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I want to put things sort of in a procedural context because it's very important, and why I decided to have these meetings this week, and we planned this pretty hurriedly. I think it was the beginning of last week, or shortly after the Christmas break ended, that, I'll hold it, that there was an announcement that Max Baucus, along with Dave Camp, and one other Republican, I can't remember, anyway, had introduced what's called Fast Track Trade Authority. And there's a fair amount of confusion among people about what is Fast Track, how does Fast Track relate to TPP, and what does this all mean? Fast Track is procedural. It's been used for two major trade agreements, and only two, and that is for NAFTA and the WTO. We've had Fast Track 5 of the last 19 years. So it hasn't been in effect. The U.S. has entered into dozens of bilateral trade agreements in the interim that were subject to the regular scrutiny of the legislative process and review and much more input from Congress. Fast Track is an extraordinary procedure where Congress gives up its constitutional authority to basically regulate foreign trade. And that is Congress cedes all authority to the president. And the way it works is they put window dressing on it and they say, president will be delegated this authority, but there'll be regular consultation with Congress, and we'll have consultation with certain members of Congress, and there'll be standing committees to advise the president and all that. All that's hortatory, none of it's binding, and none of it happens. What happens under Fast Track is the president can secretly negotiate a trade agreement. At the end, the president can sign the trade agreement, which to other nations means it's a done deal, because they're all parliamentary systems, and therefore, once they sign off, they know it's going to become the law of their land. But Congress gives the president the authority to sign it, then gives the authority to the president to write the implementing legislation. Congress would not write the legislation to implement it. And in these trade agreements, often U.S. laws are modified. For instance, when the WTO was adopted, we lengthened the term of patent for pharmaceuticals in that bill. So that was wrapped into the bill itself by the implementing legislation passed under Fast Track. So the president has the authority to negotiate, to sign. The president and his staff have the authority to write the implementing legislation. Then the president refers that legislation to Congress. It comes in a form where it cannot be amended by Congress in any way, and Congress has 60 days to take an up or down vote, no amendments, and a limit of 20 hours on debate. A pretty extraordinary concession of the authority of the Congress to the president. And as I said, it's been used, it was used for NAFTA and the WTO, and it's particularly instructive with NAFTA. The country was in a different place when we did NAFTA. I was opposed to NAFTA from the beginning and talked about how it was designed only to protect the movement of capital to Mexico to access cheap, exploitable labor and lack of environmental laws. It wasn't about benefiting workers in the United States as it was sold, and we were going to get 450,000 jobs out of it. It wasn't about raising the living standard in Mexico. It was simply about a corporate movement to a place close by where they could produce much more cheaply by exploiting labor and destroying the environment. A lot of people didn't believe that. A majority of the public at the time supported it until it was done, finally finished, and submitted to Congress under Fast Track, and then some of the details started to come out about the fact that there were no protections for labor, there were no protections for the environment, and if there was a dispute under NAFTA, the dispute would be decided by a secret private tribunal And corporations would be allowed to bring complaints against nations for various offenses under NAFTA. And this has happened. And most recently, and I don't want to get into the environmental issues too much, but a company called Lone Pine that's in Canada that does fracking for natural gas was wanting to frack in Quebec. Quebec passed a temporary moratorium, which is under Canada law, their right as a province. And this company opened a subsidiary in the US and has now sued Canada to go to a secret tribunal for $250 million in damages for profits they would have made were they allowed to frack in Quebec. So it's a way of subverting sovereign laws. And we'll get into that later with the TPP, because it would, as they say, NAFTA on steroids it is, particularly in the area of challenging sovereign nations by corporations. So all these things started to come out with NAFTA, that there was no labor, there was no environment protections. And it looked like we were going to beat it, actually. I was organizing at the time, and a guy named Dave Bonnier from Michigan, great, then our whip, was organizing, and John Lewis, or a bunch of us together. And then the Clinton administration said, we're going to lose this vote. So they said, here's what we'll do. We will amend the agreement later. We can't do it now. We've been negotiating for 10 years. If you vote against it, it's all done, and we'll never have an agreement with Mexico and Canada. But we'll fix it later. We will have non-binding side agreements on labor and the environment that aren't and have no force of law. But if you vote for it, we'll negotiate those in later. Okay, well, Congress, that swayed the vote. We lost narrowly. And, of course, later has never come. We've never gotten labor. We've never gotten the environment. So fast track is really a critical part of the device. If the president doesn't have fast track, he's then dealing, in this case, he's negotiating with 10 countries that have parliamentary systems. So they know what they sign on the bottom line. As far as they're concerned, that's exactly what's going to happen. And huge parts of this are unpopular in various nations. It's very unpopular with people who know about it in Australia and New Zealand, because the pharmaceutical companies will be able to challenge their formularies and lower priced drugs. It's unpopular, and as we'll hear about later, in developing nations, because they'll lose access to generic drugs at a low price to treat AIDS and other things. There are other aspects that are very unpopular. So they want to know it's a done deal, because they're getting something in certain places, losing something in another. But then if Congress comes back in and they lose the something they got that really benefits them, and they still get the bad parts that the U.S. insisted upon, that's our section that deals with pharmaceuticals, that's the insistence of the U.S., then they would say, whoa, this is, we can't have that. So they want to know it's an up or down vote. So the negotiations haven't concluded on TPP, but if Congress passes fast track in the next month, which is their plan, then the president will go to Asia in March, sign the TPP, and bring it to Congress for a 60-day up or down vote, no amendments, sometime later in the spring. So that's sort of to put things in context. Now we'll move from putting it in context to actually talking about the substance of the TPP and why it would be a bad deal for the American people, and why it's not a great deal for many of the participant nations and their citizens, and who it really is good for, which is a number of large multinational corporations. So I think we'll start, I guess we'll start at home. So we'll start with domestic concerns with Tom. So just introduce yourself and talk about concerns from labor's perspective. Oh.
Wow, that's heavy. Hi, my name's Tom Chamberlain, and I'm the president of the Oregon AFL-CIO, and thank you for inviting me today. 2014 marks the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, which was the first of the series of a number of different trade agreements. And the American people, I got the tail end of what the congressman had to say, was promised a lot of things. We were promised that we'd net 1 million jobs. We were promised that our living standards would go up. Didn't happen, did it? We didn't net 1 million jobs. We've lost jobs. In fact, our trade deficits have gone up as well. They were promised to be lowered. 540 billion today. And wages that were promised to go up actually have been reduced in real dollars by $3,300 per family. And that's a family who's only making $27,000. Well, we make things in Oregon. We're a manufacturing state, whether it's Daimler trucks or parts for Boeing aircraft or wood products. We make things, and we're really proud of that. The electronics industry is no different. We're a state that had been a state that exported a great deal. But as we've seen with these trade agreements, it's really impacted our manufacturing, impacted Oregon as a manufacturing hub, where once we saw paper mills dotting the landscape across this state, what we see today are paper mills being packed up and shipped overseas and the good middle-class jobs to go with them. Today we have a handful of paper mills in this state. But trade agreements like NAFTA that actually is a template for future trade agreements, you know, they're made for capitalists. And capitalists have one goal, and that's to make profit. Profit at all costs. And it's very difficult for the United States, difficult for Oregon, who have high labor standards, high environmental standards, to compete with countries that, if they're lucky enough to have those standards, they're not enforced. Capital goes where they can make the most profit. And then we have trade agreements like the Colombian trade agreement. And I'm just going to sort of piggyback on to what the congressman said about promises. One of the biggest hurdles in the Colombia trade agreement, getting it passed, was they actually killed their unionists in that country. And to get Congress buy-in to pass that trade agreement, they created what they called an action plan. And that was a plan that the Colombian government would ensure that there'd be labor peace, that union leaders would be protected. The problem is that there was no enforcement in that agreement. The problem is, last year, 38 union leaders were killed in that country. The problem is that the inspectors that were hired to enforce that trade agreement, it's a corrupt system, they've received bribes, and it's not being enforced. And the action plan that our Congress and their president swore to enforce, it's not being enforced. And as I said, 38 union leaders have been killed in that country. The workers there have been exploited. More and more corporate farms. Trade agreements, as they are written today, don't lift all boats. They bring everybody down. And it exploits workers, whether they're in the United States or in this instance I'm describing, Colombia. Thank you.
Why don't we get Deborah, since the microphone's on that side, and Deborah will discuss some of the environmental concerns.
Hello. My name is Deborah HIGBEE SUDYKA, and I'm the vice chair for the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club here in Corvallis. And thank you very much, Congressman DeFazio, for inviting me. The Sierra Club has grave concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and strongly opposes fast-track legislation, which would remove the ability of Congress to ensure that trade pacts protect the public and the environment. So, why is TPP significant? It will potentially impact every aspect of our lives. The TPP is a huge pact that will govern about 40% of the world's gross domestic product and 1/3 of world trade. Today I'm going to offer a few comments about how the TPP would harm the environment and then speak about the impacts of fast track. First, I want to say a bit about the process. The TPP has been negotiated in virtually unprecedented secrecy. Still not a word of draft text or even U.S. proposals has been publicly released, except, of course, what has been leaked, despite the fact that the pact has been under negotiation for more than 4 years and may be concluded in the next few months. The public and the media, and until very recently, even members of Congress, have been completely shut out of most of the process. Those involved in this process are 600 industry representatives who are official advisors to the United States Trade Representative, who is the part of the U.S. government that negotiates trade agreements. Those who care about the climate and energy implications of these pacts don't need to look any farther for trouble than the list of energy advocates to the U.S. Trade Representative, which includes representatives from Halliburton, Chevron, GE, National Coal Council, and others who make up the biggest fossil fuel corporations in the world. Those who will profit from the TPP want you to believe that it will enhance trade and investment, promote innovation, economic growth and development, and support the creation and retention of jobs. However, the TPP is less about trade and more about deregulating the Pacific Rim economy and providing super rights to corporations. This trade deal has been called NAFTA on steroids. What it should be called is a corporation, super rights, and deregulation deal. I wonder if that would get people's attention if we started calling it that. Getting to the substance, there are 29 TPP chapters. From the Sierra Club's perspective, one of the most dangerous chapters of the TPP is the investment chapter, which includes provisions that give corporation polluters new rights at a time when we need to be reining in their power. The investment chapters of TPP would give corporations the right to sue governments in private trade tribunals, as Congressman DeFazio explained, for unlimited cash compensation over laws and policies that corporations allege reduce their profits. This would make them more powerful than governments. It would replace policy with rules that corporations write. For a cautionary tale of what tribunals can do, using rules similar to the TPP, corporations have launched over 500 cases against 95 governments. Approximately 60% of the time, the corporation wins. So a cautionary tale was one that Congressman DeFazio referred to, the fracking in Quebec. And so another cautionary tale is a nuclear energy in Germany. The German parliament made a decision to phase out its nuclear power program and shift towards cleaner renewables. That's after the nuclear accident when Fukushima happened. Vattenfall, a Swedish energy firm with investments in German nuclear energy, sued Germany for future losses that it may sustain during the nuclear phase-out. Vattenfall is seeking $4.6 billion in damages from the German people. This means practically any new law or regulation in the U.S., even right here in Oregon, like new limits on greenhouse gas emissions, new regulations on fracking could be challenged as a result of the TPP. Again, this will give super rights to foreign investors, like big oil, big pharma, Wall Street investors. This will go far beyond our domestic constitutional protections for property rights and due process in the United States. The U.S. already favors property rights and corporate rights more than any country in the world. The TPP would also increase natural gas exports, and therefore fracking across the United States. This is because the TPP would require the United States to automatically approve all exports of natural gas to countries in the agreement, including Japan, which is the biggest natural gas importer. The Sierra Club has been opposing LNG exports because, number one, LNG exports would expand fracking in the United States in order to feed foreign markets. More fracking means more toxic chemicals in our land and water, more health risks to communities living in the areas close to fracking, more hazardous smog forming and climate-altering pollution into our air. Number two, LNG exports are also terrible for our climate. There are tremendous greenhouse gas implications with cooling, liquefying, transporting, and then regasifying the gas. And number three, it will lock us into more fossil fuel investments and infrastructure at a time when we should be investing in clean energy. As you may have heard last week, the draft environmental chapter of the TPP was leaked. The overarching problem with the environmental chapter is that there is no enforcement. It's supposedly intended to help ensure that more trade does not put pressure on scarce natural resources of the Pacific Rim, like our forests, fish, and wildlife. Unfortunately, the leaked test is extremely weak and completely unenforceable, and will actually serve to exacerbate damage to the environment and biodiversity of the Pacific Rim. It doesn't take strong enough stance against illegal wildlife products like elephant ivory, tiger pelts, or shark fins. It doesn't go far enough to prevent illegal logging. It doesn't discourage overfishing. The 12 countries negotiating the TPP accounts for 1/3 of global fisheries production. So the stakes are high. These countries need to phase out harmful subsidies that lead to greater harvesting of fish than is sustainable. Last week, Michael Bruin, executive director of the Sierra Club, said that if the environmental chapter is finalized as written in this leaked document, President Obama's environmental trade record would be worse than George W. Bush's. So here's where fast track comes in. Fast track legislation, which was recently introduced by Senator Baucus and Congressman Camp, and I think the third one was Orrin Hatch. Is that right?
Yeah, you were thinking,
Yeah.
right.
Would remove the ability of Congress to ensure that trade pacts like the TPP protect communities and the environment. It would allow the president to sign the agreement and then give it to Congress for a straight up or down vote, with no room for amendments and limited debate. The Sierra Club strongly opposes fast track, and we call on our members of Congress to reject it as well. So, in conclusion, we urgently need a new model of trade that works for, not against, community, trade unions, and the environment. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you, Peter, for inviting me. My name is Peter STOEL, and I'm the leader of the Corvallis chapter of Results. Results is a national organization that addresses poverty both here in the U.S. and overseas. We've really covered some great topics that affect the poor around the world, and how we can address poverty. The environmental impacts affect the poor very heavily. Following up on that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the impact on people in the farming field, in the small producers around the world. As we know, NAFTA is the predecessor for this and a model for the TPP, and it was devastating in Mexico, where the NAFTA agreement allowed just unlimited amounts of very inexpensive and subsidized corn to flow into Mexico, and completely devastated the market there for the small producers. Thousands of peasants were growing corn and selling it, and they were wiped out. So this led to the pressure on the U.S. border. The peasants had to go to the cities in Mexico and then on to the United States. After that, there was a big hue and cry about the impact in agriculture, and in later negotiations, particularly after Seattle, there was a tremendous impact in Doha, and especially at Cancun, where the WTO was trying to negotiate. The protests among the civil societies and the peasant organizations was overwhelming, and we were able to stop further inroads. As you can imagine, there are a lot of countries around the world where small farmers are a big deal, and their protests have really ground to a halt the agricultural aspects of the World Trade Organization. So the TPP is really an effort to go around this deadlock in the WTO over agriculture. And basically, what they want to do is for food producers, those farmers who are not producing the commodities for the industrial food, feed, and agrofuels complex, the big industrial complex, agricultural complex, they're going to be completely excluded from the TPP negotiations. And as we mentioned, the special privileges and access is given to the large corporations in these negotiations. Congress is being pretty much excluded from access to what's going on in these negotiations, but the largest corporations of the world have advisory committee, and they are close. And of course, that means the big agrochemical corporations and the biggest, agricultural complex, industrial complex companies in the world. They are really very interested in the TPP. So there are 12 countries involved with the TPP, and it's, as I said, a central goal to circumvent the WTO deadlock and to make sure that so-called agricultural liberalization is given a big forward push. This would just, expand the protections for investors over the consumers and the farmers, and would really restrict the ability, which is in place now, for governments to use public policy to protect various aspects of the agricultural community, our local farms and local agriculture. So like here in Oregon, even things like something that's very popular, having the place of origin for your food. You can see that in the stores. This is under threat. Countries may feel that having this labeling on your food is detrimental to their ability to sell their products, and this could be questioned and pulled. We've had this, it's a very popular thing. I think we all like to know where our food's coming from. This could be jerked, and they would no longer have to put this label on. That's just one small way that it would affect our local farmers. It's this TPP in terms of agriculture, it's going to bring it back into the negotiations on these big trade pacts with a vengeance. And that's going to be harmful to the poor. I think you were going to talk, do you want to talk a little bit about the drug situation?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, well, our next panelist will talk a little bit about the problem overseas as well as domestically with pharmaceuticals.
Just get close so I can hear.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and thank you, Congressman, for organizing this discussion, for all your leadership on these issues. My name is Arthur STAMOULIS. I direct Citizens Trade Campaign, which is a national coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, consumer, and human rights organizations working together for trade policies that put people ahead of profits. Some of you may know our local affiliate, the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign, and for both CTC and Oregon Fair Trade, our standard for evaluating any trade proposal is pretty simple. Does it contribute to a more just and sustainable global economy? And unfortunately for the TPP, unless there's some radical change in direction, the answer to that question is undoubtedly going to be no. Has been, as people have said, after 4 years of negotiations, after requests by literally hundreds of thousands of Americans, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is negotiating this pact, still refuses to tell the American public what it's been proposing in our names for the TPP. If new fast-track legislation is approved, negotiators would never have to show the public any TPP texts until after the pact is signed, amendments are prohibited, and changes become all but impossible to make. Meanwhile, since day one, negotiators have granted hundreds of corporate lobbyists access to the texts. So representatives of Walmart and Wall Street, big ag, big oil, have been able to scrutinize and suggest changes to the U.S. proposals throughout this entire 4-year process. And obviously, who gets a say in writing the rules that govern the global economy is of critical importance. As we've heard, it's of importance in terms of what jobs are available to Oregon families and the wages and benefits that those jobs pay when we're competing with countries like Vietnam, where workers earn a minimum wage of 28 cents per hour. But not only that, the TPP also affects other aspects of our economy, our public health, the environment. The TPP actually contains 29 separate chapters. As was just mentioned, one of the chapters that leaked, the intellectual property chapter, shows U.S. negotiators pushing provisions that would extend the length of monopoly drug patents. So right now, if you look at a disease like HIV, when there's a monopoly drug patent in place, an HIV medication can easily cost well over $10,000 per patient per year. When the patent eventually wears out after 20 years and generic competition is introduced, the price can fall as low as $100 per patient per year. So a wide gulf. $10,000 per patient per year, $100 per patient per year. If the TPP moves forward and these longer drug patents are enacted, that's obviously going to mean higher healthcare costs for developed countries like the United States, and longer periods of time where people in poorer nations simply cannot access life-saving medications. The group Doctors Without Borders has called the TPP the worst trade agreement ever for access to medicines. And of course, we're not just talking about HIV medications, we're talking about cancer medications, heart disease medications, everything that people take medicine for would be affected. As we heard, the environment chapter of the TPP leaked just this week. As of now, the environmental protections in this pact are even weaker than in trade deals negotiated during the Bush administration. There's nothing to prevent in the TPP to prevent corporations from shifting jobs throughout the Pacific Rim to take advantage of weaker environmental rules. And in fact, as was alluded to, there's another chapter in the TPP, the investment chapter, that actually gives corporations new tools to flat out attack our environmental laws, but not just our environmental laws, any new law, new regulation, even court decision that eats into their expectation of profits. Challenges that aren't heard in the U.S. court system or any other country's domestic judicial system, but rather in international tribunals made up of trade attorneys, often corporate trade attorneys who work for Fortune 500 companies as their day jobs. These are tribunals that ordinary citizens can't access, that small businesses operating domestically can't access. Instead, they set up a parallel justice system for the exclusive use of transnational corporations. And these tribunals, they don't have the power to literally rewrite our laws, our regulations, our court decisions, but they do have the power to award damages worth hundreds of millions, and in some instances, even billions of dollars, taxpayer money. Whereas if the U.S. or any other country doesn't want additional cases brought against them, they have to get in line. And unfortunately, it doesn't even end there. The TPP has chapters that we haven't seen yet, but that we've heard whispers about, like a financial services chapter that would handcuff our ability to regulate banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, to put in place the sort of common sense regulations that are needed to head off the next financial crisis. There's what is essentially a food safety chapter. We'd love to see a food safety chapter that set a floor on food safety below which no country could go. We suspect the corporations advising on the TPP are instead recommending a ceiling on food safety above which no country can go. And as we heard, there are other chapters that would affect, country of origin labels, all sorts of consumer right-to-know measures. The TPP even has, as we heard, a government procurement chapter which dictates how we as a democracy can make decisions about how we can and cannot spend taxpayer funds. And that chapter is widely assumed to attack Buy America public procurement preferences, requiring that all countries in the TPP, Vietnam, Japan, Mexico, Canada, all of them, be considered American when it comes to government purchasing preferences and government contracting. So, I could go on. Let me just say that, needless to say, these policy decisions matter. They affect our livelihoods. They affect our quality of life. They affect the future we leave for our kids and grandkids. And these decisions should not be being made behind closed doors with corporations getting a seat at the table and the public shut out. They need to happen in the light of day. There needs to be full public scrutiny, public participation. And so, again, I want to thank you, Congressman, for opposing Fast Track for the TPP and for all your work on this issue.
Okay. Thanks, Arthur. So, we're going to move on to taking the questions. I just want to re-emphasize a few points that were made and just read a couple little things here. We've talked about how corporations would be given this investor state privilege. That is, they can allege that their profits have been diminished or their future profits impinged upon by new rules or laws adopted by one of the member states. And it doesn't even, the origin of this is pretty simple. And in NAFTA, it was U.S. companies wanted to go south of the border, but since Mexico had had a revolution and expropriated Standard Oil, and the Mexican courts don't recognize the same level of property rights as in the U.S., they said, well, we don't want to invest south. We need this. So that was sort of the genesis for that, which was capital wants to move to foreign countries. They want to be assured that they can get it back out and they can't be expropriated. But this goes so far beyond that. This doesn't even include real property investments by a corporation. It includes, for example, the expectation of gain or profit that has been eroded by a new rule, regulation, or law adopted in one of the member countries. For instance, I've been trying to reform the mining law 1872 since I got to Congress. We've done it twice in the House, never gotten through the Senate. Maybe someday we'll get there. But if we were the largest, some of the largest mining companies in America are in Canada. Under the TPP, they could say, well, you have now diminished our profits because of these new reforms you've imposed and new environmental regulations on mining in the United States. Therefore, you must pay us the difference in value every year from what our expected profits were, or you have to repeal your law. That's the way it works. I had this argument with a guy named Mickey Cantor, who was Bill Clinton's special trade representative. And I said, so they're going to make us change our laws. He said, no, you don't get it. I said, no, I get it, Mickey, you're right. We can keep our laws if we want to pay for them. And I'll give two quick examples, and then we'll move on. And one of them is really bizarre and perverse. We subsidize cotton in this country. We shouldn't do that. We need agricultural reform, but we do that. Brazil fired a complaint in the WTO saying they subsidized their cotton to our detriment. We lost the case. They won. Well, we can do one of two things. We can repeal our subsidies, or we can pay Brazil money. Well, we're paying Brazil $147 million a year so we can subsidize cotton growers in the United States. I mean, now, that's kind of a weird and perverse example, but let me bring another one that maybe more people can relate to. There's a technique that's that's used by particularly Mexican fishermen to catch tuna in the Pacific off Baja and Southern California. It's called fishing on dolphin. And you catch tuna by throwing giant nets over schools of dolphin because the tuna congregate underneath. Unfortunately, you kill all the dolphins. There was a huge reaction against this in the U.S. We adopted the dolphin-safe tuna labeling requirement. Mexico went to the NAFTA tribunal and they won. That is trade discriminatory to put on the label, mandate has to say on the label, this is dolphin-safe tuna. And so we lost. So actually, we no longer have the mandatory labeling requirement for dolphin-safe. So then we adopted a voluntary standard of dolphin-safe. And Mexico has again gone to the NAFTA tribunal to say this is trade discriminatory, and if they do that, they have to pay us annual damages if they want to have voluntary labeling of dolphin-safe. I mean, this is how unbelievably intrusive and expansive these things can be. And I mean, just let your imagination run wild. He mentioned drugs, and this may be a way we can kill this thing. Lori Wallach, who's an expert on this, in Washington, D.C. With Public Citizen, has a leaked copy of the chapter that relates to intellectual property and drugs. And it's her interpretation, and she's a very smart lawyer, that it would allow pharmaceutical companies to challenge the U.S. law where we, through a formulary, buy cheaper drugs for the VA, for our veterans. They get the cheapest drugs in America, and we save a lot of money as taxpayers, and they get great access to drugs, and Medicaid. We do it in those two areas. It was outlawed by the Republican Congress. We can't do that in Medicare. We can't negotiate lower drug prices. But we can and have in Medicaid and in veterans. And in Australia and New Zealand, they would lose their formularies, and our pharmaceutical companies would be able to challenge their formularies and say that that's a trade constraint and that they should be able to sell more expensive drugs there and other drugs that aren't permitted under their laws at a higher cost. So these things can be so intrusive. And the last point, this could be the last trade agreement. And people say, well, how's that? Because they came up with a great new idea. Let's put all the best stuff we can think of as corporate CEOs, the worst stuff we can think of as consumer, labor rights, human rights, environmental activists, into one trade agreement, adopt it, and then let anybody who wants to sign on to that agreement with no further consideration by any of the member countries' elected governments. So they're calling it a living trade agreement. And China has already said, hey, you get this done, we want in. And our special trade representative is so excited with the idea that we might let China into this agreement. And so this could be the last trade agreement ever, and it would last forever. So I don't even know. I haven't seen the whole thing because I'm a member of Congress. I could read the whole thing in my office without staff if I wanted to, not take notes, and then not talk about it because it's a classified document. So I don't know whether it has a provision where we can get out. NAFTA has a provision we can notice 6 months that we want out or we want to renegotiate it. We've never done that. The World Trade Organization says once every 5 years you can opt out. Ron Paul and I brought a resolution to the floor of the House, and we voted on that several times. Last time we got 110 votes. But I don't know that the TPP may be a living agreement in that you are forever bound. We don't even know that yet. So those are some of the things that confront us here. So it sounds like science fiction, to tell the truth, but unfortunately it's very real. So with that, I would be happy to take some questions. I'm part of the Fair Trade campaign in Congress led by Mike Michaud, a former paper worker, union member from Maine. There's about 10 or 12 of us very active in the group, so I was invited to the White House to meet personally with the president in a group to discuss TPP. And I'll tell you, I don't believe, he doesn't have he had Larry Summers as an economic advisor. He doesn't have a great grasp of economics, and particularly economics as it relates to average people. And he defers to too many corporate advisors. And in this case, the president did not demonstrate to me that he understood the things we're talking about here, that it would usurp that much of what we believe in and what he's campaigned on and what I think he believes in. I don't think he has a full grasp of that. That's part of the reason why I'm here. We don't have a lot of time. What they think is going to happen is if we pass fast track in February, he goes to Asia in March and signs the agreement. So we've got to get a national movement going that they can even hear at the White House. So maybe he will say to his advisors, why are all these people upset about this? There must be something I don't know. And then maybe we'll get through to him. But I really don't think he knows. So, yes, sir. That's the best I can do. But anybody else wants to chime in on these can. Go ahead.
Ending corporate personhood and money speech by a constitutional amendment was endorsed by 75% of Corvallis citizens in 2012 and the state legislature last session. You received a request from the city of Corvallis and the state of Oregon to work for such an amendment. How is this going? And do you see corporate personhood and money as speech contributing to the excessive role corporations have in drafting this TPP?
I tell the truth, I'm not sure how many. I think there were 5 bills introduced in the last Congress to amend the Constitution to either totally repeal or reverse so-called Citizens United. I was a co-sponsor of 4 or 5 of them. The Republicans refused to even hold a hearing. I don't even think the Senate held a hearing, despite the, I'm not sure, but they should. And we should reveal this. It's totally inimical to our system of governance that money is speech, corporations are citizens. And I think that this trade agreement sort of embodies that, but now internationally, with the force of the United States of America behind it. I mean, there's another case which she didn't mention, but the Sierra Club has written about in Ecuador, which involves, it ended up being Chevron, but it was someone before that. Anyway, it's a big oil company that went in there, did incredible destruction in an area the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's a US-based company that merged now, I think it's Chevron. And the government of Ecuador is pursuing them for damages and restitution. And they went to the US courts and said, give us, we want you to rule that they can't do this. And the US court said, no, you're subject to their law, and your assets are subject to their laws. So they then went to Ecuador and they lost in the courts. They've now gone to the World Trade Organization to say that the Ecuadorian government can't do this, that, to a corporation. And they have a preliminary decision in their favor. It's just extraordinary. But I mean, what are 3 trade lawyers who are looking for jobs going to do when a decision like that comes to them? So it is, I think it's kind of an outgrowth or extension of what has been put in place that's jeopardizing our system. So, from my perspective, and I'll see if anyone else, Tom's labor is very organized, the environmental groups are organized, and others, and I'll let them speak. But from my perspective, having been through this before, fast track at the moment is the key, and it's the place where we have the best potential to stop this. And I believe if we defeat fast track, the president won't be able to get, he won't be able to finish this negotiation because there's so many controversial portions, as I explained earlier, that if Congress was given, the bill without those restrictions, they would say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to do that. And then, Australia and New Zealand have signed on to get something, or Vietnam to get something and just lost it, then they're not going to be happy campers. So they're not likely to go forward and sign it if it isn't up or down here. So that's the concentration. We've been organizing for over a year, expecting this. And we have a substantial majority of Democrats. At the moment, there is no Democrat on the House signed on to fast track. I think they'll get one, and they may get a prominent one, but we're putting on tremendous pressure in our caucus to stop that. The Oregon delegation on fast track itself, I think, is up for grabs. When it comes to the agreement, I may be lone man out. I think that we can very much concentrate here at home on our 2 senators and our other representatives on the whole fast track. Why would you do this? Why would you give up that much? Why would you, agree to vote on something up or down you've never seen that could have such an impact? Makes people nervous. So that is really the focus. And to be truthful, we're going to put together a very unholy coalition. Because there are a lot of Tea Party people there who waive their little constitutions. They don't think much of the idea of waiving this authority, and they especially don't like the idea of waiving this authority to Barack Obama. Well, if I can get their no vote, I don't care why they got there. So we're organizing on that side of the aisle too. Tom, do you want to address some of labor's efforts?
Yeah, what we've been, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. What we've been doing is just that. We've been just pounding on our state senators, U.S. senators, trying to get a commitment to vote against fast track. We've been pounding on the White House. So if you're at home, if you're here tonight, the best thing you can do is pick up the phone, write a letter, call their Oregon office, call their Washington office, and just keep up the heat, because they do respond to those phone calls. I know that. I've been in this business for a long time. So that's how we'll win this thing.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to emphasize what Peter said about the extraordinary power of these special tribunals, which have given corporations the right to step in and sue governments around the world. A corporation, just this, it's an extraordinary power. under these tribunals. And I just want people to understand that, the power of those special tribunals needs to be removed from these agreements. Prior to these, to the WTO and the NAFTA, we had trade agreements, a lot of trade negotiations under a structure called GATT. And under that arrangement, if a corporation had a complaint about restriction of trade in a country, they would go to the government of their country and say, look, this is really hurting our industry. Can you bring it up? So they would have to get their government to agree to take a government complaint to a government complaint. So that's where it should really be. That's the more democratic way. You have a government-to-government negotiation about unfair trade practices. This idea of corporations taking unfair practices to another government is way over the top, and it's really removed democracy from the whole equation. So the power of these tribunals, I think we also need to bring that down, rein that in, and return it to the way it used to be, where we had government-to-government negotiations about trade, not corporation-to-government negotiations.
Excellent point. And remember, they aren't doing this under our laws. I mean, these special tribunals are only, the law is the agreement, the trade agreement. And it doesn't matter what your national laws are or your national judicial system. The only thing on which a decision is being made by a private party in secret is how does it comply with this agreement? So that's absolutely critical point. I mean, this thing would be nowhere near as dangerous, as bad as it is, if they didn't have the tribunal resolution, the investor state process. So
let's get rid of these tribunals.
Yes. No, I mean, you're actually right, and Tom is saying, I mean, there is response. I mean, if suddenly the two senators get a flurry of, if you all networked with 5 people, so we can get about 70 people here, 350 emails and phone calls or letters in the near future saying, we want you to be against fast track and explain to me how you can possibly support this, that's a lot. And they'll say, whoa, the boss got to hear about this. Suddenly there's, and I'm not just targeting and, being unfair and targeting our senators. But I want also the White House. I mean, we need a national movement that's bombarding the White House on this issue. But the labeling, you're exactly right. We passed country of origin labeling in Congress. And we passed country of origin labeling first for packaged products and then second for meat products. Mexico brought a complaint in NAFTA about meat products, and that was found to violate NAFTA, so it's not enforced. So you don't know if the meat comes from Mexico or Canada or the US. That's trade discriminatory because meat is meat. Well, problem is, in Mexico, also under NAFTA, there's an equivalence standard. So if they claim that their meat inspection process is equivalent to ours, we used to send inspectors down there and certify individual plants before it could be imported. We can't do that anymore. They say, oh, we've inspected all these plants. There's no problem. So you're right. And then to go to a further, the organic label could be threatened under this. And I worked really hard to get national organic standards. That we may be told that is trade violative. I'm sure Monsanto would say labeling for GMOs is trade violative and trade discriminatory. So it could be used down to that level very effectively. I mean, you're right. So. Talking to a colleague on the plane on the way back, and I was talking about some of the provisions I thought were particularly egregious, and my colleague said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, I know it from leaked documents. And my colleague said, well, why don't you go read the original? I said, because then I couldn't talk about that, but this has been leaked. And my colleague said, well, why not? And I said, because it's a classified secret document. And my colleague said, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. And my colleague kept persisting, so I had my staff contact, before Washington shut down today with the blizzard, the Special Trade Representative's office, and they sent us documentation that, yes, indeed, this is a classified document. And I have taken, unfortunately, we have to sign papers and take oaths about classified documents. The penalties would be very severe and beyond just sort of like, we're going to prosecute you. It's like huge, huge fines that
Citizens Trade campaign, as early as 2011, was the first to publish some of the leaked documents. And if you go to our website, citizenstrade.org, you can find all those leaked documents. You can find the analysis by labor groups, environmental groups, public health advocates, as well as the links to more recently leaked documents published by WikiLeaks. It's citizenstrade.org.
Okay, yes? But see, they have done WikiLeaks has some of the documents, but they have done extraordinary analysis, because if you read it, a lot of times it's legal gobbledygook. They've analyzed it, what are the impacts, and in a very extensive footnoted way that's, really, really instructive. Well, when I was debating a gentleman on the radio from something called the American Citizens for Emergency Free Trade, something or other, the host, this is on OPB, asked him, well, who's members of the group? And he said, oh, corporate CEOs. And, but anyway, he said, yeah, that's the threat. If we don't do this with these other countries, then China will. But then we would be exempt from the rules. And they said, oh, we'll lose the trade bloc. Well, what trade bloc? I mean, we will lose the access of our corporations to more exploitable labor under more certain conditions, which might mean they have to make some more investments here at home. So, I mean, to me, that's not really a threat. But they didn't want to put China in as a negotiator, because they just knew that would probably that might cost them the congressional vote. So what they've done is create an open-ended agreement that China can join later, and that's why they set it up that way. The normal way it works is if the president wants legislation, it's proposed, or a member of Congress proposes it for him. It's referred to committees that hold hearings on it and invite at least this is the way legislation is supposed to work in the House. I don't know if it doesn't work this way anymore, but you have hearings with people on both sides of the issue. You learn about it. Then the committee goes through a markup process where members of the committee are allowed to offer amendments, and then after the committee has successfully reported the bill, it goes to the floor of the House, and the process continues. That's what they're afraid of. They don't want this to be subject to those amendments. So 60 days isn't necessarily an inadequate period of time to hold hearings, become educated, fully understand it. But the further constraint is, even if you figure out it's not good, your choice is up or down, yay or nay. And that's when all the pressure comes to bear. You can't blow up. This was very difficult, will never happen again. China will get a leg up on us. You can't vote no, just vote yes and we'll fix it later, just like with NAFTA, and it's now 20 years later and we have not yet added labor or the environment, which Bill Clinton promised at the time would be added quickly. So that's kind of the key to this. I'm gonna ask everybody to network with some friends, go out and, get some other people, get a block of people to be contacting our representatives, all the representatives from Oregon, because they care about Oregonians, our senators, the president, and just see if we can get something going. And I'm using the provisions of TPP to educate people what's coming. If your representative votes for fast track, here's what we're going to be stuck with.